Straight Up Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Straight Up Podcast, a show where we talk about international affairs with a focus on East Asia and, of course, Taiwan. I'm your host, Chris Gorin, coming to you from Taipei, Taiwan. Today I bring you another episode focusing on what is, on its face at least, a domestic issue in Taiwan, but I bring it to you with a comparative international perspective. My guest today is Roy Ngerng, a researcher and writer who has worked on issues such as the minimum wage for many years. Roy is from Singapore and currently resides in Taiwan, where he writes for The News Lens. Roy's work as an activist and writer in Singapore actually got him into a bit of hot water over there, which you will hear about in the interview. But the focus of the interview is on wages in Taiwan, especially the minimum wage. The issue of the minimum wage has also made its way into the debate among the candidates for Taiwan's 2024 presidential election, which is only a few months away now. As you'll hear in the interview, I was really hoping to try and get at the specific factors about Taiwan's economy that make its low wages so unique among highly developed countries. Roy certainly provides a lot of insight, data, and perspectives on what factors may be playing a role in this issue. For those of you watching on YouTube, just a quick note, all the graphs and charts you see in this video come from Roy's articles for The News Lens, and I provided a link to his work there if you're interested. So now I bring you Roy Ngerng.
Hi, I'm Roy. I am an activist and writer on wage issues in Taiwan. I have been writing on the wage issues in Taiwan for the past several years. And prior to that, I was a social activist in Singapore, also writing on wage and social protection issues. So it is something that has been close to my heart.
You actually have a very interesting story about what happened to you in Singapore and how you came to Taiwan. So if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about what happened to you and how you ended up here.
Well, prior to coming to Taiwan, I was an activist in Singapore. I was writing on my blog. I have always been very concerned about wage and social protection issues. The key reason is because I believe that society needs to be happy. And one of the key reasons for that is that you need to ensure people earn enough and do not work too long hours so that they have that time to go out, to participate in society, to care for one another, to have that time to stop and think, hey, there's someone behind me, maybe I should just move aside so that that person can, move in front. Hey, maybe I should drive less fast so that I can cater to that pedestrian. So I think this is something that Taiwan needs to think about too, how the traffic accidents is also related to the long working hours and the low wages. The prevalence of road accidents. And so when I started writing in Singapore, there was this idea that if we can create a better society where people are protected in terms of wages, in terms of social protection for their pension, healthcare, then they are more willing to contribute back, and the society I live in can be happier. That's the same reason why I write in Taiwan. Because I want, and I believe in the potential of Taiwan to be a much happier society because it's a democracy. Well, what I didn't realize in Singapore was that when I wrote about the pension issue, it is a lot more complicated because of how the funds are being invested in a way that is not as transparent as it should be. Reports of the government investment firms, full transparent reports like those in Norway, are not published. So you do not get a full understanding of the kind of returns that are being earned and then channeled back to the pension funds. But more so, as I continued writing, I think I invited a defamation suit for the Prime Minister in relation to one of my writings on the pension funds.
Okay, can we just clarify that a little bit? So you were writing about pension fund issue, and then suddenly you were presented with a charge from the Prime Minister's office for defamation against the Prime Minister? Is that what happened?
Yeah. In one of my articles, I was accused of accusing the Prime Minister of misappropriating the funds and the pension. I can't go into too much detail about the suit. It is public knowledge, but eventually the court did consider me as having defamed the Prime Minister, and I was required to pay a penalty of 150,000 Singapore dollars in terms of damages and costs to the Prime Minister. That was the suit came in 2014, and then the ruling was made in 2015, and I left Singapore in 2016. So subsequently, the Prime Minister also sued 2 other bloggers, and one of them raised funds to pay off the Prime Minister in 2021. And I also did the same, and I was able to raise the funds to do that, and so did the third person. So
Congratulations.
Yeah. Yeah. I think for me, what was more important for me at that time was that I also joined and held protests after that in relation to the pension funds, and also got charged by the government for that, and had to pay.
For protesting.
Yeah, for protesting. Well, the exact charge was public nuisance for a $2,000 fine. Yeah. So I think for me, it wasn't really the legal suit, and I mean, as I've said in court, I had no intention of defaming the Prime Minister, but I feel that we need to, ensure that social protection is adequate, wages are adequate to protect people, if simply because, well, that's the decent thing to do, that's a rights-based thing to do, and I want the society to be a happier one, so that people can contribute equally to help the society grow. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I'm sorry that all happened to you in Singapore, but we're very happy to have you here in Taiwan. So for me, that's a little bit of a silver lining there.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
I think the key for me was that I wanted to advocate for fairer pension and a fairer social protection for people in Singapore. Mm-hmm. And I suppose that carries some risk when you do it in a place that might not be so receptive to such advocacy. I think I'm quite glad that in Taiwan, I'm able to do such writings, and I think they are gradually being taken a bit more positively. Recent discussions on the minimum wage in Taiwan have been quite positive. I think the government is now pushed to push the minimum wage law, and then even one of the opposition candidates, Ho Yui, has proposed a minimum wage target to $33,000.
Yeah, and that's actually what we're here to talk about today, which is a sort of very simple question, which is, why are wages in Taiwan so low? Not only to other, Western high-income OECD countries, but even countries, regional neighbors here in Northeast Asia that have similar kinds of economies and similar sort of cultural and economic factors. So why don't we actually just start there? Let's set the table for our listeners. What are the minimum and average wages in Taiwan, and how do they compare to other countries in the world?
Taiwan's minimum wage this year is $26,400. It will be increased to $27,470 next year. The median wage is $42,167 a month. Compared to the other advanced countries, Taiwan actually has one of the lowest minimum and median wages. Taiwan's minimum wage and median wage used to be higher than South Korea prior to the mid-2000s. But then, due to the wage stagnation after the 1997 economic crisis, it has stagnated and it has grown much slower. So South Korea now has almost twice the minimum wage as Taiwan. In fact, South Korea's minimum wage has grown to be higher than Japan, and its median wage has also grown to be on par with Japan. But because of how Taiwan's wages have stagnated, its minimum wage is now on par with Eastern European countries like Poland, Estonia, and Lithuania. And its median wage is also at about the same level. But based on Taiwan's economic growth, it could have reached a faster stage. So there's another country to compare with, New Zealand. Up until the early 1990s, Taiwan's minimum wage was actually catching up with New Zealand. And then right after that, Taiwan stagnated while New Zealand continued growing, and then now it's as high as Australia, almost as high as Australia.
Right. And yeah, I think the comparison with Singapore, or excuse me, with South Korea is one of the best comparisons, just because I think the size of the population, the size of the country, there's a lot of similarities in the economies of the two countries. And yet, as you say, the minimum wage now in South Korea is double that of Taiwan. And just to put, in case our listeners are not that aware of NT dollars, so you said that the current minimum wage in Taiwan is 27,000 and change, which is around $850, and the average wage is 40,000, which is about 1,200 or so, $1,300. But in South Korea, what is the current minimum wage there? Do you know offhand?
The minimum wage is about $50,000 next year based on the
50,000 NT dollars.
NTD, yeah, based on the current exchange rate.
Mm-hmm.
I think median wage, if I don't remember wrongly, is about $90,000 or so.
Okay, so that would be 50,000. That's about 1,500 or $600, and 90,000 would be around $3,000, just for our international listeners. Okay, so as you say, the minimum wage in Taiwan is close to that of maybe say Poland, but the overall GDP is much higher than Poland. So what do we know about the reasons for why Taiwan's minimum wage and overall wages have stagnated compared to other countries?
I think the key as to why Taiwan's minimum wage stagnated is because after the 1997 economic crisis, the government decided to keep costs low and therefore wages low, on the belief that they are able to try to spur business development. And I think there would be some pressure from business groups and still ongoing pressure from the business groups to suppress wage growth. Some of the rhetoric they use is that this will prevent unemployment from rising, this will prevent prices from growing. And it's really, I think, the manufacturing sector in Taiwan that wants to use the low wage growth to try to push up profits for their own businesses. I think it's not a very good strategy because many of these manufacturing companies in Taiwan also have overseas factories where costs are low as well. So the approach shouldn't be to reduce or suppress wages in Taiwan so as to use Taiwan as a base to grow profits, but rather to look at how we can grow Taiwan's value. So I think that's one thing that's missing. I think too that because of how long there has been so much influence by business groups in terms of how wage growth should be kept low, it has become quite pervasive in the discourse in Taiwan. So if you read the news, there are fears about higher wages leading to higher consumer prices, and therefore we should keep wages low. And business groups have so much control that they say instead of growing wages, maybe you should invest in real estate or stocks and not think about growing wages. So we are creating a distorted economy, I think, because of too much influence from business groups. Yeah.
I want to bring in like a little bit of the international element because you mentioned just a moment ago that part of the thing that keeps wages low in Taiwan is the fact that a lot of Taiwanese companies are in manufacturing, and these companies also have factories in other countries. And so, in a globalized economy, you might say that the minimum wage in Taiwan is a domestic issue, but actually it's these international factors that are having an influence. And it's interesting because it influences it in two ways that I can see. One is the Taiwanese companies who have factories overseas where the wages are low, but also a lot of the migrant labor which is coming to Taiwan, migrant workers primarily from Southeast Asia who are working in the factories, which tend to be some of the lower paying jobs in Taiwan where the minimum wage really affects them. So help us understand those dynamics a little bit and how that works, migrant labor and also these overseas factories.
I think for migrant labor, there is actually a lot of similarities with Singapore and South Korea that uses a lot of migrant labor as well. I think the way East Asian economies have been growing is that they feel that in order to grow their economy quickly, they need to have a large bulk of low-cost labor that allows them to build or supplement the low-cost service sectors at a faster rate in order to grow the economy. But I feel that this is misguided. One of the reasons why we have to use so much migrant labor is because we want workers to work long hours. So they have to, well, Taiwan, Singapore, South Korea pretty much has one of the longest work hours. And because there's not enough time that workers can spend at home to cook, to take care of the family, to even have their own recreational time. Therefore, they need to be able to bring in migrant workers or healthcare givers to help supplement the workload at home. But then to do so, because of how wages are still relatively low as compared to the cost of living in Taiwan, South Korea, or Singapore, therefore there is that pressure to also keep migrant worker labor cheap as well so that families can afford them. But then this creates a very distorted economic situation. I think migrant workers are seen as tools rather than as individuals or people. When you look at how Taiwan's labor ministry talks about migrant labor, they talk about how manufacturing sectors or service sectors say we need more migrant workers because we do not have enough workers. Instead of thinking about how we need to invite them into the country so that they have that choice to make Taiwan their home, we don't look at them in that way. And so that kind of mindset becomes prevalent. I think one thing we tend to forget is that because there's so much reliance on the manufacturing sector in Taiwan, there is that idea that Taiwan's economic growth needs to rely on the manufacturing sector. There is very little focus on the service sector or even just the growth of domestic industries outside of the manufacturing or semiconductor industry. So when you look at service wages, for example, they have been a lot more stagnant than the manufacturing wages. We don't realize that I think the Taiwan economy and policymakers doesn't realize that there is a huge bulk of domestic consumption that we are losing from the economy simply because we are not putting money into the hands of workers or ensuring that migrant workers can get an equal amount of wages so that they can afford all the basic needs that they can in order to help push domestic growth. And the manufacturing sector in Taiwan only makes up about a third of the whole GDP, which means that we're losing out on 2/3 of the GDP that could be used by workers to supplement domestic businesses, their profits, and the overall economic growth in Taiwan. So I think that's a missed opportunity which Taiwan might gradually realize because of how I think under President Tsai Ing-wen, even though the minimum wage has grown slower than I think it should be, but it has seen consistent growth in the last 8 years, including for next year, and it has seen faster growth than under Chen Shui-bian and Ma Ying-jeou, which has allowed domestic growth to pick up somewhat. And I would believe that the government also recognizes how higher wages can therefore contribute to higher domestic growth and help Taiwan's economy. I think when it comes to the manufacturing sector, I saw a research that compares both South Korea and Taiwan. So after the 1997 economic crisis, South Korea and China opened up at the same time to allow more investments from overseas. Both South Korea and Taiwan had the same approach where they invested in China to tap on the low cost. But South Korea also took a different approach where they also allowed wages to grow much faster. And due to the higher wage growth, it contributed to higher productivity. It contributed to companies building up more higher value innovation and products. So there are creation of Samsung mobile phones that are world-renowned as compared to Taiwan, which used to have HTC and Asus, but they are now not as powerful in that sense. And I think a huge part of it is because Taiwan kept relying on that low-cost structure. It did not use higher wage growth to push businesses to invest in more innovation, in thinking about how to transform beyond the semiconductor industry and to expand other industries. So there's also research that points to how when you look at the diversity of technological production in Taiwan, other than the semiconductor industry, the other sectors have comparatively shrunk. So Taiwan, due to the overemphasis of the semiconductor industry, it prevents other sectors from gaining resources, and the low wages prevent the overall sectors outside of the semiconductor industry to push themselves towards thinking about competing globally. So the low wage situation forces Taiwan's businesses. Actually, it makes Taiwan's businesses very over reliant on the fact that if they are low cost and I can still profit, what's the point of investing in technology to earn higher profits if I can feel comfortable with the current situation I'm in?
Yeah, and I think it also leads to, what's often referred to as brain drain, which is that, if there's any talented Taiwanese in a given industry, that's not in semiconductors, most likely they will, and, as long as they can speak English well enough, they will probably go abroad where their talents will be more well rewarded than they would be in Taiwan because the wages are so low. And there's one story I have that I think I've told on air before, but maybe not on this show, which I think kind of illustrates this well, which is I once went to a meeting with the CEO of a large company in Taiwan, and one of the reasons that we were having this meeting was because this person wanted some consultation on how to attract more foreign talent to Taiwan to his business. And so we sort of talked about this issue of wages. And, he was very well aware that the wages in Taiwan are low, and that's the difficulty in attracting foreign talent. But what he didn't really seem to be aware of was that the most basic answer is, well, you just have a higher wage. You offer a better package to these foreign talented people to come. And it was pretty clear that that was not on the menu for him. And, what he wanted the government to do was to essentially make the exchange rate between Taiwan dollars and US dollars better, so that, as he put it, each dollar that he's paying in Taiwan will be more valuable instead of actually just paying more to his workers. And so this is I think a challenge that I'm not really sure how do we overcome this if the business community in Taiwan doesn't actually feel that they need to raise wages. What do you think of this issue of brain drain and how wages affect it?
I think the problem with when you mentioned about how domestic businesses were asking the government to provide more support, one of the things that came to my mind was that they were also asking the government to increase domestic consumption in Taiwan while keeping wages low. And that is just a major contradiction, because how can you increase domestic consumption if you do not want to increase wages? Even if you increase the profits of businesses or wages at the top tier, they are still not sufficient to push wage growth or consumption growth, because most of the growth needs to come from the purchase or the consumption of basic necessities, and those at the top tier are already able to meet their basic necessities, so they'll be spending more on higher end or luxury items. So we do need to ensure that more money goes back to the lower income so that they can expand their consumption on basic necessities. I do think that the Taiwanese worker population is actually very innovative. Just at where I was working, when we are discussing, I used to work as a researcher at two research institutions. When we were discussing as colleagues, there are a lot of ideas about the kind of research we can do. But then when we speak to our bosses, then it becomes control. It becomes, because Taiwan's work environment is very hierarchical, and your bosses tend to have an overall say. And even if you do give feedback on certain ideas, it's not generally taken in, at least based on my experience working as a researcher. And so part of the reason is that there's no respect for that worker. And I feel that the broader macro issue is that if wages have been so low for the last 20 to 30 years and so suppressed, it gives a lot of power to employers and businesses who think that they have the say and the control to not just control the wages of workers, but their work hours, the way they think, the way they should respect the boss. It disempowers the workers. It prevents them from being able to adequately challenge the system, to help to contribute to the company to think about innovation. And I think part of this is due to the wage stagnation. I think the other thing is that the wage stagnation has also created this discourse among business groups that you have to keep wages low if you want to grow the economy. There is no new thinking around how the economy can grow. So a few years ago, I was doing a research with the research center that I was at, and we had a focus group discussion, and we were speaking to the participants about the kind of strategies we need to grow Taiwan's economy. So one of the suggestions put out was that Taiwan needs to move into the higher value economy, to not just be a contract manufacturer, to also develop brands. But then this is a conversation that has been happening in Taiwan for a long time. So another participant pointed out, instead of moving into higher value manufacturing, maybe we should just think about how, say for the semiconductor industry, we can develop better technical products, but low cost. So I think Taiwan has reached a stage where wages have been so low and stagnant that the policymakers and businesses have decided to just accept that maybe Taiwan doesn't have the capacity to grow and expand to be on par with South Korea when it can. So I think one of the other reasons is also because of a lack of exposure to the international research and discourse that is happening. If you look at Western Europe or United States, there's a lot of research coming out that talks about how higher inequality leads to social problems, it leads to polarization and distrust in the government. Inequality also prevents the economy from growing faster, and in fact, it is inequality and the polarization that it leads to that creates slower growth for economies. So there is that idea that we need to move towards higher wages, so that we can have higher economic growth, fairer growth. But all this is not coming into Taiwan, partly due to a lack of exposure to the international media, partly due to the environment in Taiwan that has become so consistent in its lack of awareness of this research outside, that there is no local research that try to drive a local understanding of the situation in Taiwan.
Yeah, and again, I feel this circling back to my sort of original question, which is like, so what are the factors in Taiwan that make it so unique? Because I feel like some of the things you're saying we do see in other countries, and especially, the best comparisons I think are Japan and Korea, because there are so many similarities. And I do think that the sort of work culture where perhaps like lower level employees are not listened to and everything, those are also things that you might encounter in a Japan or a Korean company. So I am curious, like, what seems to be the factors here? Because even we have seen wage stagnation, for example, in Japan as well. But the big difference there is that, Japan at the height of its economic growth was just much higher per capita than Taiwan ever got to. So even though that they stagnated from a point that was much higher. Whereas in Taiwan, it never got to quite that level of per capita income. So do you see anything unique to Taiwan, or is it just this kind of cloud of various factors all interacting, or is there something in particular that you notice here that other countries that don't have to deal with?
I feel I might try to compare with Singapore.
Okay.
That's okay.
Yeah.
I think before I came to Taiwan, I was looking at the, wages are low, but I was thinking the cost of living is low. It's generally thought of as being low before I came to Taiwan. There is relatively strong social protection in terms of the national health insurance. There is unemployment benefits of 60% of the last drawn wage. So I thought Taiwan as a democracy would have better labor protections, better wage protections. So that was the impression I had. But after living in Taiwan for, I think, the last 7 years or so, there's a more nuanced understanding between Taiwan and Singapore. So Singapore is politically authoritarian. It's difficult to speak up about social issues. But then at the workplace, at least for white collar or high income groups, and even the civil service sector in Singapore, there is a lot more responsive environment. Part of the reason is because I think Singapore responds to the international companies who come and set up offices, and they tend to also bring along values that might be considered progressive, that you need to respect the human rights of workers, you need to have same-sex marriage, for example, you need to ensure that workers have enough annual leave and time off, for example. So all these are built into that system, and workers get to be heard in part because of the employers that come from Western democracies that also bring these ideas to Singapore. So there is a huge contrast in terms of the government being more authoritarian and the workplace being relatively adaptive and flexible. And then I come to Taiwan, and politically, people believe that you need to speak up, you need to respect the freedom of press, you need to allow people to organize. But then at the workplace, it is a very different situation.
Right, it's like the opposite from Singapore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then I feel part of the reason for me, I feel, is that if wages are so low for such a long time, it prevents the social culture, it prevents workplace culture from changing. That there is research that talks about how higher inequality reduces government efficiency, because then workers are not able to contribute ideas, they are not able to feel empowered to think about solutions. So that has happened in Taiwan as well. And another reason, I think, is due to the lack of I feel it's also the media control in Taiwan that prevents a lot of the discussion from happening. It doesn't, even though Taiwan's media is free, it is still dependent on political factions, and it is also dependent on business interests. And real estate companies, for example, have a lot of control. And when you look at real estate news in Taiwan, as compared to other countries, you see a lot more news in other countries, advanced countries, about how housing prices are too high and it's not able to allow young people to buy housing, to have a proper place to live and build their families. In Taiwan, the rhetoric is, oh God, housing prices are going down. Young people will not be able to buy higher housing prices in order to invest and sell it off so that they can buy another one and keep earning that money.
Right.
So that is the kind of distorted logic that is being pushed by businesses in the local media. So even if there's free media, it prevents more open and competitive economic discourse from being discussed in Taiwan.
Well, that's actually a good transition to ask now that you're mentioning real estate, because it's not only that wages are low in Taiwan, but it's also that the cost of housing is extremely high compared to the wage. I would say it's an even greater ratio, or a more dramatic ratio between income and cost for housing as compared to many other countries. So I know that you've done some calculations about what it would take to have like a decent life in various Taiwanese cities. So tell us about what your calculations there and how that compares to minimum and average wages in Taiwan.
I think other than housing prices, the other thing that is disproportionate when it compares to wages is the grocery prices and food prices in Taiwan. I'm not talking about eating out, I'm talking about buying groceries at supermarkets. So if you look at the trend between consumer prices for food and the basket of 17 basic necessities that the government tracks, you can see that they have grown faster than the minimum wage. So every time the minimum wage grows, businesses tend to use it as an excuse to grow grocery prices faster. In fact, grocery prices in Taiwan grew at about a similar pace as New Zealand, but New Zealand's minimum wage grew much faster than Taiwan's minimum wage. So if Taiwan's minimum wage should have grew at the same level as New Zealand, it should be more than $40,000 today. If Taiwan's minimum wage should have grown on par with New Zealand's housing prices and minimum wage proportionately, it should be more than $35,000 today. So Taiwan's housing prices and food prices therefore create distortion in terms of the consumption that people can have, So just to add one more thing, if you compare in terms of housing consumption and profits of businesses, domestic businesses, you can see that food prices have continued growing. Food profits and food consumption have continued growing. But then when it comes to consumption and other basic necessities like health, education, recreation, all this have stagnated after the minimum wage stagnated. And so too have the profits of domestic businesses, which therefore suggests that people still need to buy food because it is the most basic necessity. But then they have to give up on other necessities. By giving up on these other necessities, then the domestic businesses that earn from such necessities are losing up on the income and profits they could have earned, and therefore preventing Taiwan's domestic economy from growing faster as well. So I think that's one thing. In terms of the minimum income needed for a basic standard of living, I've tended to use Numbio's cost of living estimator. So Numbio is a crowdsourced platform where individuals in the different country are able to input the cost of living amounts needed, and you can use Numbio's estimator to estimate how much you would need. So there is a living wage concept that is being discussed in many advanced countries. As an advanced country, other than allowing individuals to meet their most basic needs for food, housing, and basic clothing, we also need to consider that they should be able to, say, go for recreation, maybe watch a movie once a month, maybe go for a mid-range restaurant once a month, and even have a vacation once a year, a relatively inexpensive vacation. So that they are able to distress from work. So this is the discourse that is happening in many advanced countries. So when we talk about the basic income needed, we should also cater for these. And when you use Numbio's estimator to estimate for these amounts, it would range from about $35,000 to $40,000 in the cheaper cities. But then in northern Taiwan, say in Taipei and New Taipei, you might even need up to 60,000 or more, in part because of how housing prices are so expensive in Taipei.
Sorry, just really quick. So in Taipei, you say around 60,000 or more. Again, that's about $2,000 and more than double the minimum wage. And then in a cheaper city, maybe like in Kaohsiung, you said 37,000, maybe
40,000.
Okay, it's still about, you would need 50% more than the minimum wage to reach that, even in those less expensive cities.
But I think it might have to be more nuanced. So there are living wage calculations being done in various countries in the United Kingdom, Singapore, Australia, for example. And there is a need to discuss with local workers and citizens what they think is the living wage needed. So do we think that housing prices should include housing mortgage or housing rental? But so in Singapore, the living wage calculation done by academics include the housing mortgage because the majority of residents want to be able to buy their own place to stay, and that's the same situation in Taiwan, where I think a survey says that about 87% of Taiwanese want to also buy their own place. So it would make sense to include housing mortgage. And then if you consider Taipei and New Taipei, the current minimum wage would be way out of range, even for median wage, which is about 40 to 50,000 in Taipei.
Right. Yeah, and I would say in Taiwan that home ownership is an even more essential part of life in many ways than in some other countries, because in traditional families, like usually the children don't really move out until they buy their own house. They don't there's fewer renters because it's kind of just like the sort of, in the culture, the necessary step, to get married and everything is like you have a house and a car and then you get married and have kids. And without that, you probably are still living with your parents. So I do think it's important to include home ownership in Taiwan. Another question I want to ask you, which I sort of was thinking about when we were discussing the difference between Singapore and Taiwan economies, and how, Singapore work culture tends to be a little bit more open, maybe from the influence of these international companies being there. And then I was also thinking that that may also be true of a place like Hong Kong. And when I think about those two places, Hong Kong and Singapore, compared to Taiwan, the main difference that I see is the English language. So I did want to ask, how much do you think having English as a base language of, both business and life in a place like Singapore or Hong Kong affects and the mobility that provides for international companies and also the people living in Singapore and Hong Kong to go abroad? How does that affect the work culture in those countries, and therefore, and how does that get reflected in wages?
I feel a bit conflicted when talking about English because I do work better in an English environment.
Right.
But at the same time, there are arguments that I've read that is English that necessary, because then you see Japan, you see Germany, and some other Western European countries that do relatively well, even Sweden, Norway, that do not use English as the main language for communication at work.
But I will say, like, Germans almost all speak English very well. And also, both Germany and Japan, I think, are just much larger countries that have a large internal market, that have a lot, Japan, not so many natural resources, but, compared to Taiwan, Singapore, and I would say Taiwan, which is obviously bigger than those two places, but nevertheless, it relies on an export-based economy heavily because the internal market just isn't enough.
I do agree. Yeah. I feel though that one of the reasons why English has become a major issue for Taiwan, to look at what research is being done outside and to replicate it in Taiwan. And therefore, there's that thinking that maybe what is lacking is the English language. We might need to allow Taiwanese to be more frequent readers of the English language so that they can look at international news, look at how the research being done overseas in English and replicate it in Taiwan. So I feel it's both. It's partly due to the lack of having a grasp of a language where a lot of such research and discussion is going on. I feel that in Singapore and Hong Kong, the other reason why they are also more developed is due to being financial hubs. They are forced to try to attract more businesses to invest in their cities. And due to that upward pressure, it does allow wages to grow at a faster rate for the high-income earners. I think similar to what is happening in the United States, maybe in financial centers like New York. The danger with Singapore and Hong Kong, however, is that the wage growth is very highly unequal. So for Singapore, I was sharing with you that in white-collar industries and in high-income sectors, there might be more, a more liberal environment where bosses might be more willing to listen to you. But then you also get migrant workers who earn even lower pay than in Hong Kong and Taiwan, and even South Korea and Japan. You get a lot of low-income sectors, say even childcare, teachers, service sectors, where wages are so low and workers are not able to have their voices adequately heard. So there is that huge disparity in these places. I think for Taiwan, wages are simply just very equal because they're all equally low. And
Yeah.
part of the reason is there are no more competitive sectors that pull up wages at the other aspects. There is a semiconductor industry that pretty much relies on, in the past, pushing down wages. So there is therefore no impetus in any sector to try to push wages up.
Well, all this talk about wages begs the question, what do we do about it? And as it turns out, there's a presidential election in just a few months from now. And the minimum wage has actually become like a major issue between the candidates in terms of their campaign platforms. So tell us about, what some of the candidates have been saying about raising the minimum wage, and what the prospects are for us to see a big change there after the next presidential election.
I think of the three presidential candidates right now, there is only the Kuomintang candidate, Ho Yo-yi, who has proposed raising the minimum wage to $33,000. Though the DPP candidate, Lai Ching-te, did mock him to say that the $33,000 increase would only be a 20% increase from the minimum wage next year, which would be lower than what President Chai did in 8 years. But then if Ho Yu-yi is able to increase it to $33,000 in 4 years, his increase would be even faster than President Chai on an annual basis, and even faster than any elected president since 1997.
Can you just linger on that point for just a moment? Because when you say, if we raise the minimum wage to $33,000, that would be a 20% increase. On the face of it, that sounds like a quite large increase. But then, as you say, Lai Ching-te, who's also running for president and is the current vice president, and so has been, in the Tsai Ing-wen administration now for 2 terms, is saying that, but that's actually 20% is actually less than we've done in the last 2 Tsai Ing-wen terms. But I also know, because we've done some reporting here at RTI in the past about that Tsai Ing-wen had actually promised to raise the minimum wage to $30,000 within her first term. And as we know, her second term is about to end, and it's still only at 27,000 NT dollars. So I guess I have a couple of questions there. Why should people not think of a 20% raise as being as massive as it sounds? And also, why should anyone even believe Ho Yu-yi if he says they'll do this? And when Tsai Ing-wen had basically made a very similar claim and did not follow through.
Well, I think even though Ho Yu-yi made the promise, I am not sure if if you look at a lot of comments online, there are doubts as to whether that the $33,000 target will be fulfilled, even if he is elected as president. I think, though, when election promises are made, there should be an effort to keep them, and the fact that President Chai has not been able to keep that promise and there is a need for the electorate to question whether they should hold the candidates accountable for their promises. I think it's a lot more complex, in part because even if promises are made in Taiwan, there is a larger issue hanging, and that is the threat from China. And it is easy for DPP to say that as the only party that people might trust to protect the country's national security, voting for DPP is more important as compared to other social issues. And this is a kind of rhetoric I do see from some of the DPP supporters. And I feel that the DPP needs to recognize that if your concern is to protect the national security and democracy of Taiwan, you need to recognize that if wages are low, and inequality is increasing, there is research that shows that support for democracy also weakens. People would have doubts as to whether democracy is able to provide for their livelihood needs. And there is, and that's why there is that polarization where you see some people and even young people are more willing to vote for a candidate like Cohen's, a third party who people have termed as a populist. And if you look at the populist trend in Western Europe and America, people who tend to the societies become more polarized and move towards populist because of that economic polarization that also happens in their countries. And this is happening in Taiwan as well. But because there is not enough research or recognition of the problems by the ruling party or by the economists or academics in Taiwan, there isn't that awareness that the threat to Taiwan might also lie within, in terms of how workers are not being protected and therefore lose trust in the government and lose trust in the democracy as well. I feel that DPP have been a bit too pro-business as well. They were elected to be progressive, their name is the Democratic Progressive Party, and young people voted for them in the last 8 years ago and to some extent 4 years ago, because they hoped that the DPP could revolutionize or reform Taiwan's economy. But this hasn't happened because the same economic model is still being used to pursue Taiwan's minimum wage economic growth. In fact, I think under President Chai in 2017, when she said that her ideal minimum wage is $30,000, her vice premier did suggest at that time that the minimum wage could be increased to $30,000 within a 4 to 6 year span, if we regularly increase it by about 6 to 8%. But President Chai at that time said no to it because she felt that businesses will increase their wages as the economy grows. This hasn't happened. And so there is therefore doubt as to whether, even under DPP, the DPP precedent, when Ho Yui made that promise that the minimum wage could go up to $33,000, Lai Ching-te says that he would instead focus on the minimum wage law. But this was also a promise that President Chai made, and which has still not been fulfilled. So there is now pressure by the Executive Yuan and the Labour Ministry to try to push this forward. Which comes back to the question: the minimum wage law is intended to ensure that the minimum wage is increased to a level that is adequate based on certain economic factors. And the Labour Ministry is now saying that the cost of living and consumer prices is the key indicator that has achieved consensus. And so when Ho Yui says that he wants to increase the minimum wage to $33,000, this is still far from the minimum income needed for a basic standard of living in Taiwan. And the minimum wage law, if implemented, would at least in theory allows the minimum income needed for basic standard of living to be calculated so that when minimum wage increases are discussed, we have a benchmark to raise it to, such that it will benefit workers. Yeah.
Do you, I'm just wondering, like, do you have a sense of the average Taiwanese voter, how much of an issue are wages for them, especially the minimum wage, because that's really the only one that the government can control, and two, do they see the connection between raising the minimum wage and the effect that it might have on their wage, which is not the minimum for most people? Because my third question is kind of, when people talk about the minimum wage in Taiwan, I wonder if they're more associating that, like if they say the minimum wage is X number of NT dollars, are they immediately associating that number and that wage with migrant workers? Or are they also thinking about like the lower rungs of the Taiwanese workers? I don't know if you have any sense of that, but do we have an idea of like how many Taiwanese people are actually making minimum wage in Taiwan?
So in terms of the recognition of the problem of the minimum wage, it has become a very political issue. People who support the DPP would tend to try to sideline that issue even if they recognize it's an urgent issue, because they feel that you need to vote in a party that can protect Taiwan's sovereignty and democracy. Those who tend to vote for Ko Wen-je, we have seen that they came up with for the protests in terms of housing. Ko Wen-je also is very adept at talking about how wages are low, housing prices are high, and therefore you should vote for me. So he is also tapping on that grievances by the middle swing voters who do not have strong political alignment with either DPP and KMT. And I feel that the KMT might not have a very adequate understanding of the issue, in part because their voter base is a much older population. So I don't think it's easy to discuss the issue because of how politically polarized Taiwan's environment has become. And even when Ho Yui brought up that $33,000 minimum wage target, then the response from the other groups were, where are you going to get the money from? Or even when they proposed raising healthcare subsidies for national health insurance for those 65 and above, the natural response at that time from the DPP supporters was, again, where are you going to get the money from? But then the DPP government after that said that they will make changes to the national health insurance in response to that. So there is that recognition of the problem, but politically the conversation does not allow a very critical discussion to happen because of, first, the polarization and how the politics are being played in Taiwan that is more accusatory, that doesn't focus on policy-specific data. I think that's one. The other thing about how Taiwanese might not recognize the minimum wage as benefiting them is due a lot to misconceptions being spread by business groups, as well as the overall economic idea or concept that has been pushed for the past 20 to 30 years. So business groups have a tendency to say that you shouldn't support the minimum wage increase because it will only benefit migrant workers. But what they don't talk about is how there is a huge proportion of service sector workers who are earning low wages, just above the minimum wage. And even for the starting salaries of university graduates, any kind of graduates in Taiwan, there is about 25% who are earning the minimum wage. There are about half of the population that are earning less than $30,000 among the starting salaries of graduates in Taiwan. And among the overall industry and service workers, about 20 to 25% of them are earning less than $30,000. When the minimum wage increases, it also enables median wage, average wages, and wages across the board to increase as well. And this is something you can see in Taiwan's data. From 2012, every time the minimum wage is increased, you can see the median wage increasing by a similar magnitude. The reason why it feels like the average worker are not benefiting from the minimum wage increases because minimum wage is increasing so slowly that the effects are not being felt across the board. So if minimum wage increased by $1,000 and median wage increases by $1,000, that is still not significant to support the cost of living needs, especially if you're looking at how the basic standard minimum income needed for a basic standard of living right now could be anywhere between $40,000 to $50,000 or $60,000, depending on the city you live in. When median wage workers are earning $42,000 and increased by another $1,000, it is only able to allow them to buy a bit more basic necessities instead of allow them to save or allow them to move their money into supporting, recreation or holidays. So therefore, there is that sense that the minimum wage increase is not adequate. And also, like we said just now, whenever the minimum wage increase happens, food businesses tend to also increase the minimum wage at almost a similar rate that prevents the cost of the purchasing power from matching.
You mean the food companies increase the price of food?
Groceries.
Right,
yeah,
right.
yeah.
Okay.
So, well, just looking at other countries, if we're looking at just comparing with advanced countries, I did a comparison. So when minimum wage increases faster, there's a tendency for median wage to increase even faster. So the key reason why in Taiwan median wage has only grown at a similar level as the minimum wage when we compare in terms of dollar value is because of how stagnant minimum wage is growing, that it doesn't have that power to push up median wage or average wages across the board. But then in countries like Estonia, Luxembourg, Australia, and some of the Western European countries, minimum wage is growing a lot faster, and there is therefore that push to push median wage to grow even faster. So if you compare the trends in these countries, minimum and median wages are actually becoming, their lines are becoming further and further apart if you compare it in the chart. But that does not mean that minimum wage is stagnant. It means that it has been growing so fast that it has pushed up median wage growth. Yeah.
Is there any mechanism or accountability, any way to hold a politician accountable for any promises that they make on this front? And do you get the sense from Taiwanese voters that this is an issue that really matters to them? In other words, would they punish a political candidate for not fulfilling this promise on wages, or do you feel like it doesn't rise to a high enough level to motivate a Taiwanese voter to either change their vote to someone else on this policy or to punish even someone that they used to support who didn't fulfill this promise?
I think Taiwan's elections, I don't think people would punish based on the current voter population, the large proportion of the population that would vote for the DPP would still remain at this current stage, and punishment of the political parties might not happen at the presidential election. But then at the last local election, the DPP lost quite heavily. In fact, it won one of the fewest seats since democratic elections began. I think actually the fewest seats they have ever won. And so I think voters are hedging their bets in terms of the local election and the presidential election, because that is perhaps the only way they can do it, since it is not feasible for them to punish the DPP for not fulfilling its promises, at the risk of them thinking that other parties that are voted in might not protect Taiwan's democracy or sovereignty as well as the DPP. So that I think at this stage it has evolved to this. Though I think that because of Kerwen's party rising, there is now a group of swing voters who are willing to believe that there could be a third party who could still manage the relationship with China, yet still also maintain that allow social protection and wages to rise. I'm not sure yet, because it has not been a tested concept, because he has not become the president. So depending on how the results of the next election show, I think it would also change the dynamics between how the general population believes they are able to push back. I do feel though that the current wage stagnation in Taiwan, the huge problem is due to the economic mindset that has been perpetuated, and how we need to have a new mindset. And that really requires the government to look at the data, policymakers to look at the data, to realize that if minimum wage rises, it actually benefits the economy, it benefits businesses, it benefits profits. And if the government can understand that, they need to have a proactive communication plan to let businesses and the general public know that this is what is happening, and to push back against the misconceptions that is happening, and to help Taiwanese workers and businesses understand how a wage-led growth can be beneficial for Taiwan. And I think this is what is lacking, but we are slowly moving into that. And the minimum wage law is a tool that can allow that communication to happen. But it also requires that politicians, business groups are willing to revisit their economic assumptions. And I'm not sure if the wage stagnation is enough to push policymakers or academics or business groups to think in a different way.
All right. Well, Roy Ngerng, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. This is a really interesting issue, and I'm sure that it will continue being discussed not only through the election, but just into the future as this wage problem stays with us here in Taiwan. So thank you so much for coming in.
Oh, thank you. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to share in a more comprehensive way.
Sure. Yeah. Anytime. Okay. I think that's good. This is the first episode, which will be released along with video on YouTube podcasts. So hello to any new listeners and viewers out there, and hello to all my old-time audio-only listeners as well. Feel free to reach out to me with any comments or suggestions in the comments, or you can shoot me an email, chrisg@rti.org.tw.
It's a straight up podcast.